Welcome to the Alum Fellows reading series with our alum fellow, Mary Hicks. Another esteemed alum fellow, Zizi Packer, will be introducing Mary. Zizi is a distinguished writer of numerous nonfiction and fiction works, including the acclaimed short story collection, Drinking Coffee Elsewhere. She is at work on a novel, The Thousands, as well as a book on Breonna Taylor. Zizi, would you like to start?
Yes. Thank you, Krishna. Thanks so much for that introduction. It's just my honor to introduce Mary Hicks, with whom I was a Hutchins Fellow not too long ago. And I just remember those fantastic days and nights just where I was just sort of sitting under Mary's light, listening to her talk about and helping me out with my novel a great deal. So I just want to say a few words about Mary. She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago. She's specializing in the Black Atlantic with a focus on transnational histories of race, slavery, capitalism, migration, and the making of the early modern world. So this is her first book, Captive Cosmopolitans, Black Mariners and the World of South Atlantic Slavery, 1721 to 1835, where she reimagines the history of Portuguese exploration, colonization, and oceanic commerce from the perspective of enslaved and freed Black seamen. Black mariners, she argues, were an integral force in forging a unique commercial culture that linked the politics, economies, and people of Salvador da Bahia with those of the Bight of Benin. In addition to investigating the lives of African sailors, she also explores the cultural and religious sensibilities of enslaved and freed African women who were living in the 19th century in Salvador de Bahia. Along these lines, her second book will detail the emergence and elaboration of a new gendered and racialized subjectivities in the wake of Portugal's initiation of the trade with West Africa in the 15th century. Her published works include Financing the Luso-Atlantic Slave Trade, Collective Investment Practices from Portugal to Brazil, 1500 to 1840, in the Journal of Global Slavery, and Transatlantic Threads of Meaning, West African Textile Entrepreneurship in Bahia, Salvador de Bahia, 1770 to 1870, and Slavery and Abolition. She received her BA from the University of Iowa and her PhD from the University of Virginia, where she was a recipient of a Jefferson Fellowship, and she's also received the Ford Foundation Dissertation Fellowship and the Mamelin Fellowship at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University. She's the winner of the Southern Historical Association's Latin American and Caribbean Section Dissertation Prize and has been the finalist for a CGS ProQuest Distinguished Dissertation Award for the Humanities and Fine Arts. Thank you, and please welcome Professor Mary Hicks.
Thank you so much, Zizi. I really appreciate the warm reception from Krishna and also the people who are working behind the scenes really hard at the Hutchins Center. It brings back so many wonderful memories of having been a fellow myself. It was a really special year 3 years ago, and looking back on this manuscript as I was preparing today, I was thinking the interdisciplinary environment of the Hutchins Center was so integral into the book it became. And it's really special also to be here with Zizi Packer, who I admire so much as a writer and who actually helped me come up with that title, Transatlantic Threads of Meaning, because we were going back and forth with ideas late one night in the Hutchins Center offices. And of course, as a writer, she has a way with words and helping me really crystallize what I was trying to say in that piece. So I thank her for being here today and also for being really integral into how I have framed some of my published works. So I want to begin with the introduction to my book, which is titled The Sea is History. So I'll jump right in. Fugitive slave announcement. On the day of June 7th, 1830, escaped from the alley of Guindaste number 5, a slave named Fernando of the Mozambique nation, while in the service of the canoes and boats of Mineiros Beach, where he has always had the custom of denying his owner and saying that he was free. Today, if he is found in São Mateo or in Bahia, it is believed he would travel with a fraudulent title of manumission and work as a mariner. In 1830, the well-heeled readers of the Jornal do Comércio, Rio de Janeiro's premier periodical, learned of the travails of an African sailor named Fernando. Hailing from the Mozambique nation, he burst forth from the fog of anonymity as his owner detailed his dramatic maritime flight from slavery in a series of advertisements published over the course of 3 years. These fragments laid bare a life lived in motion. Born in Eastern Africa, enslaved and forcibly transported to Brazil, Fernando was an escravo ladino, or a acculturated and Portuguese-speaking enslaved person, laboring as a shipman and sailor in the thriving early modern port located on Guanabara Bay. Likely hired out by his owner as an escravo gigano, or wage-earning slave, his bondage demanded mobility for the profit of his owner. Compelled to move for the interests of another while living in the wake of involuntary dislocation from his homeland, Fernando's mobile labor ironically became the source of his empowerment and self-fashioning. Accustomed to offering his expert services to passing ship commanders in Rio's harbor, he falsely proclaimed himself to be in the possession of a title of free status. Though his owner scoffed at Fernando's impudent habit of denying him, the captive seaman's insistence that his lived experience of self-possessed independence contradicted his legally constituted enslaved status threw in stark relief the social fluidity of Brazil's watery environs, even for laboring Africans and their descendants. The veracity of Fernando's declarations of freedom perhaps went unquestioned in a space characterized by the frenetic circulation of a diverse array of merchants, passengers, mariners, artisans, and petty traders, as well as newly arrived captive Africans. On Brazil's sprawling waterfronts, free and enslaved, native and foreign-born, the wealthy and powerful, as well as the destitute and desperate, rubbed shoulders daily. The resulting ambiguity certainly fed Fernando's bold assertions, as well as the self-conceptions of many others like him. These fleeting documented moments reveal tantalizing details of the subjectivity he imagined for himself and vividly convey a life situated in the interstices of exhilarating independence and cumbersome servitude. At first glance, Fernando appears a confounding figure to encounter in the archives, one who defies our archetypal visions of an early 19th century defined by stark dichotomies between mastery and slavery, domination and submission. Entering Fernando's world on the bustling littorals of the South Atlantic reveals a space where Africans and Creoles dominated the ranks of maritime laborers. In the very moment of the transatlantic slave trade's intensification in Brazil, however, men like Fernando charted an independent path. His experiences of servitude entailed an autonomous working life, as he engaged in the entrepreneurial act of contracting him out to for pay to random ships arriving in his home port. Laboring side by side with Brazilian, European, and African-born seamen, both free and enslaved, empowered him to imagine a different status for himself altogether. At sea and in port, the thin line between acting free, claiming freedom, and being free could disappear in an instant. The malleability of enslavement for such men sprung from the particularities of the place they inhabited, which irrevocably shaped their sense of the horizons of possibility. Challenging our most steadfast images of Atlantic slavery, as exclusively defined by physical captivity, rural isolation, and social death, the maritime spaces of colonial and imperial Brazil open new vistas for scholars. Far from the plantation landscapes of the Americas, experiences of enslavement diverged from historians' familiar models. Fernando's story and the stories of men like him not only trouble long-held characterizations of bondage, but also disrupt well-worn narratives of imperial expansion in the Americas and expose the contradictions of freedom before and during the age of emancipation. In the South Atlantic, the arduous nature of work to which one was assigned defined slavery less than the instrumental use to which one's owner put one's labor. As ancient Roman writer Varro famously concluded, the enslaved were speaking tools, both objects and subjects whose fungibility made them ideal vessels for their owner's will. Profiting off the labor of one's human property did not always require physical confinement. Utility rather than purposeful degradation informed owners' motivations in supervising their bondspeople. Though slaveholders endeavored to make their enslaved property mere instruments, the enslaved exploited their own instrumentality to carve out autonomous spaces for themselves. Brief glimpses of Fernando's life reveal such a trajectory. Geography remained crucial to his watery liberation. Despite his relative self-sufficiency, he chose not to remain in Rio de Janeiro under the nominal control of his señor or owner, instead striking out to a neighboring port in the north, Salvador de Bahia. Place mattered in his quest for an alternative status. The ability to inconspicuously move between locales as an enslaved mariner assured the success of his escape. His attraction to another urban center of pulsating maritime commerce and the benefits it conferred was hardly surprising considering his experiences of bondage in Rio. In lieu of selecting a site of intensifying abolitionism as his new home, however, he escaped to one of the most active slave trading ports in the Atlantic world. What attracted the man to such a brutal space? At the time Fernando arrived in Salvador, he would have witnessed a port city oft described as breathtaking in its beauty. The entrepot thrived not only as a hub initially of colonial and then imperial commerce, but as a voracious consumer of enslaved men, women, and children disembarking from the coast of Africa. Situated in the Bay of All Saints, an expanse of water named in honor of the day it was first discovered by European navigators in 1501, Salvador received a staggering 1,730,070 enslaved individuals from Africa over a period of nearly 300 years. Slavery left its profound mark on the city. As a preeminent oceanic port in the South Atlantic in the 17th and 18th centuries, the turbulent sea which surrounded it gave rise to an urban world of stark disparity and hardship in juxtaposition with ostentatious wealth. The spatial organization of the city itself exposed these profound inequalities. Located on a sharp bluff, the elevated upper city conveyed the political and economic power of the mercantile elite who easily moved through perfumed gardens and elegant facades. Submerged below in the lower city, the urban poor toiled alongside unscrupulous merchants and rugged seamen, while slavers disembarked alien captive Africans onto fetid, winded streets, detaining them in a series of dilapidated dwellings lining the waterfront. The two spaces, tethered together only by a steep road, were joined physically and metaphorically by slavery. Too perilous for horses or oxen to traverse, enslaved Africans strained under the weight of the goods and the people they ferried back and forth on the passage between the upper and lower portions of the city. While the fruits of the enslaved labor inside Salvador and on the sugar and tobacco plantations that surrounded it accrued to the Bahian elite, maintaining them in ostentatious splendor. Because trade was the lifeblood of Salvador de Bahia, waterborne commerce permeated every facet of life. The built environment, the composition of the population, as well as the productive lives of its residents, were all deeply dependent on the port's relationship to an increasingly interconnected Atlantic Ocean. Salvador was not just a place in the Atlantic, but an Atlantic place. Life there remained intimately tied to the ebbs and flows of Atlantic commerce and politics, which connected the city to an array of geographically and culturally distant ports, particularly in Europe and West Africa. Indeed, most of the city's population lived by oceanic trade and transportation, including merchants, ship captains, and seamen, as well as a sizable number of auxiliary laborers, such as sailmakers, stevedores, and ironsmiths. After its founding in 1549, the oceanic entrepot quickly became the heart of the Portuguese Empire, the second most prolific importer of enslaved Africans in the Americas, and the busiest port in the South Atlantic. Salvador's aquatic orientation reverberated through its inhabitants' lives for the next 300 years. Life in Salvador drew from an older Portuguese maritime tradition. Beginning with the dawn of Portuguese navigation in the Atlantic during the 15th century, Black waterborne mobility underpinned imperial oceanic exploration and settlement, particularly in Salvador. African and Creole seamen not only provided the physical labor necessary to man the central machine of Portuguese commercial and imperial power in the early modern world, the oceanic sailing ship, but also furnished sea captains with the critical skilled labor, including navigational, commercial, and medical expertise that was necessary to make long-distance sea travel a reality. Nowhere was this more the case than on slaving ships that continuously traversed the South Atlantic, replenishing an indispensable labor force in the city's hinterland. By 1775, an astonishing 90% of all maritime laborers in Bahia were Black, including sailors employed on transoceanic vessels, 40% of whom were Black and 35% of whom were enslaved. Ships navigating to the Mina coast, Angola, and Benguela were especially prone to employing African enslaved sailors. As observers noted, these vessels were, quote, accustomed to equip with a small number of 4 to 6 white sailors, supplying Black captives with the rest of the majority that go. Bahia enslavers' dependence on enslaved and freed African labor continued well into the 19th century. Between 1810 and 1829, at least 36% of all mariners laboring in the slave trade were African-born, and 27.8% were enslaved. All told, the intensity of the transatlantic slave trade radically transformed the urban population of Salvador, especially the city's maritime labor force. The historical rupture created by the transatlantic slave trade and the dawn of the Atlantic Age thus created a paradox. The very movement required to facilitate empire and slavery's expansion gave rise to processes of cultural and intellectual world-making by the enslaved and colonized themselves. As the Portuguese consolidated their seafaring commercial power, African maritime laborers became integral to the very spaces that constituted the world of the South Atlantic. West African coastal communities, slaving ships traversing the Atlantic, and Brazilian port cities such as Salvador. Within these key nodes of an emergent South Atlantic system, Black mariners' cultural, commercial, and intellectual influence suffused Portugal's imperial project. As intermediaries between merchants and the enslaved Africans, African potentates, and ship captains, they ensured the successful operation of an emergent merchant capitalism enmeshed in transatlantic slavery. Following their movements through the increasingly interconnected early modern world allows us to create an alternative map of the Atlantic and its powerful commercial currents. So that is a short excerpt from the introduction to my book, Captive Cosmopolitans, and I very much look forward to this conversation with Zizi.
Thank you so much, Mary. That I just remember, yes, I mean, we should definitely have a round of applause for that.
Amen.
Yeah, I think this was,
I can smell the salt water from right here in Harvard Square.
Yeah, and I, in particular, I think that I attended one of your talks, Mary, and that was the first time I think that someone had pretty much gotten a book, gotten a book of publication, right at her talk. I just had a sort of, I'm excited to begin all of this. Your discussion of how this was not just a place in the Atlantic, but an Atlantic place, which is a sort of paraphrase you had said from Alejandro de la Fuente. I'm just wondering how, and if you can elaborate that, because I mean, the book kind of goes into this, and not just particularly how it's as particularly Atlantic place, but a South Atlantic place versus like a North Atlantic place. Could you just kind of elaborate on that
yeah, that's a great question. When I read that in Alejandro de la Fuente's book on Havana in the 17th century, I was like, yes, exactly. This is exactly evoking the kind of sense that I get from reading these records of especially the 18th century in Salvador. And so what I really mean by that is that we should think about it not as the transplantation of a European sensibility or political economy, or West African sensibility or political economy, but really this kind of dynamic interplay between the two. And of course, my book really plays up the West African influences. I write particularly about the role of material culture and West African medical knowledge in remaking these spaces, and especially how people experience day-to-day life in the port city, especially the laboring population, some of whom are enslaved, some of whom are freed. But I mean, you could also say that Africans being, in a sense, socially dead. I mean, I do agree with that theorization. At least initially, they are socially dead. They are totally deracinated from the communities, the kinship networks that they have come from by the transatlantic slave trade, are forced to create something new. And a lot of what they create is incorporating remnants of indigenous cultures they encounter, of European cultures that they're then asked to confront. For instance, European religiosity. They really make Catholic a Catholic sense of sociability their own through their own initiative. But it's really that an Atlantic place for me means some place that has sort of been, it's a combination of people who've been almost destroyed through their displacement, who then have to remake something out of the kind of remnants, the shards of what are left, and they have to apply their ingenuity and creativity to that. As well as, you know, just in day-to-day life, being on the Atlantic, being in that oceanic space, which plays a huge part in my book, is a really important part of everyone's day-to-day life.
And you kind of talk a little bit about, and the first two chapters about imagination. I mean, this is sort of a thread of like being able to project oneself onto a possibility for these Black mariners, for them to be able to project a future in which they can do more than just be enslaved, becomes a way in which they do what you're saying, is they sort of like be able to borrow from the indigenous culture. They use this sort of their sort of agency as these mariners on the ocean, but then also in these littoral spaces, like in the shores and such, to be able to then engage in commerce. And then their liberty chests are the ones that are sort of these places in which they can store the material. And that becomes this way in which they can sort of begin to build this future for themselves, which I found just completely fascinating. And so I can see how this is very much the Atlantic space that you're talking about. My question would be like, I'm always just sort of flipping through and just sort of thinking, we went like, oh, is there any way in which the liberation that they are, you know, that they can fashion for themselves, not only just them for themselves, but for others? Like, I mean, I know that, sorry, I'm splitting two questions into one. Kind of when the abolition was at its strongest, you know, in Britain and et cetera, and other places, you know, it seemed as though in the South Atlantic, it became more clandestine, you know, so it's sort of like, I'm thinking, like, instead of liberating, you know, it seems as though you have the mariners who are then seeing, okay, I can leverage the situation and make more money with enslaved people and selling them. So were there, like, in the archive, did you find these spaces of liberation for others as well as themselves? I guess is the question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it really gets to the heart, the tension, the dramatic tension of the book. So I think there's multiple things. One is, I think it's easy for us as sort of modern liberal subjects to imagine that creativity, agency, desire for liberation is channeled towards sort of one direction, which is freedom, citizenship, autonomy, which I do believe is important to them, personal autonomy. But one of the things I try to get at in the book is that for them, this kind of self-making and world-making could take on a totally different trajectory. So they're very proactive in creating religious spaces and trying to affect what in essence is the kind of, you know, metaphysical supernatural environment around them through the manipulation of material culture, for instance. So that's an example of creativity and agency that doesn't quite neatly fit in our box of what we think enslaved people should be desiring and putting their energies towards. And then on your sort of second related point is, if they had agency, how to explain, or if they had a degree of agency. I don't think the book makes the claim that they were sort of free to do whatever they please, right? They were highly constrained historical actors. So if we accept that they had a degree of agency and creativity, what would it mean to say that in fact some of them participated in the transatlantic slave trade even after the moment that they're personally manumitted? And then, you know, does their desire for their own personal freedom from slavery, which meant some of them do attain manumission through their maritime labor, the kind of benefits it confers, do they then try to free others, liberate others? And I think it's a really complicated question, because we see moments of, for instance, in Catholic religious brotherhoods, of their forming this kind of nascent notion that freedom should be expansive and categorical rather than just individual. So for instance, I write about free soil laws and how Black brotherhoods in Lisbon assist runaway, escaped enslaved sailors in achieving freedom, or at least they attempt to. And part of their legal argumentation, which I think does get to their imagination, is that there shouldn't be slavery. At least some of the legal suits do make that claim, which is more than an individual claim of I personally shouldn't be enslaved, which is the more sort of ancien regime, you know, early modern, before abolition becomes a real intellectual force in the Atlantic world, that's a more common kind of legal claim to make. And so in that instance, we can say that some of these men are trying to enlarge freedom, enlarge liberty, but in other senses, once the transatlantic slave trade becomes clandestine around 1810, at least partially clandestine, it means that, you know, who is going to engage in this dirty business of clandestine slaving? It's going to be the most marginal members of buy-in society, and sometimes those are freedmen. And you really see the rise of this sort of commercial class of mixed race or Afro-Brazilians who are quite engaged in illegal slavery, illegal slave trading. And so I think it's complicated. I think in different places and times, people form a more expansive notion of liberty and who it should apply to than in others. And, you know, at times these people are very opportunistic. And I think what the book strives to do is to explain, well, how can we understand their opportunism? What are they trying to achieve? And how is that legible, you know, by way of the kind of social and cultural milieu in which they're existing?
Yeah, I really loved what you were talking. I mean, that the chapter on free soil and the mariners being able to use a sort of free soil law, ironically enough, to kind of like, you know, address all these sort of what I think what you call it like alternative juridical consciousnesses or something, you know, and whereby they're able to sort of, and I guess this is my sort of third question blended together, you know, they were able to then sort of have this knowledge of the law in all these various different ports in all these various different countries. They use that knowledge of the law to sort of to say, basically, I should be free, I should be mandated. And you were talking about the Catholic brotherhoods where they could just sort of join these, you know, use religious tenets and sort of this sort of idea to kind of then free themselves and sort of argue for freedom. So I guess my question in that, embedded in that, is that it was a fabulous chapter on imperial law and free soil and et cetera. Like, how did they get this knowledge? I mean, on the one hand, you know, yes, they go to these different ports, they go to these different cities and these different places, but you know, their vocation is in being a mariner, being a, you know, and oftentimes we imagine they have then no education, and with the exception of maybe I think it's the hula maybe, who were the oceanic people who, you know, had, you know, ocean spirits, etc. You know, this was their kind of, this is what they knew, you know, was the ocean as opposed to the law. So how did what in the archive showed you the sort of trajectory or how they went about learning to use the law to their benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really counterintuitive because I think one of the interesting parts of that chapter is that most of the individuals trying to apply this free soil principle are African born, right? So we can imagine they're arriving in these various ports, Lusophone ports of the Atlantic world as teenagers, probably adolescents, most of them. And then in a matter of, you know, for some of them, a decade or something like that, they come to understand this sense of there is a monarch, there is such a thing as an imperial power, which is paternalistic in some senses, or at least articulates itself in that way. That there is this network, Black religious network that traverses the Atlantic involving Catholic brotherhoods, and that these spaces can be resources. And I think one of the intriguing things about that chapter is that, again, it kind of pushes on this idea of individual aspiration, because I'm assuming that part of the legal understandings that people come to when they're making these claims on the Portuguese imperial state are collective. So even some of the language you find in the petitions can be a bit repetitious. And so it means that these claims are, I think I use the term in the book, polyvocal, right? They're articulations of multiple people, and you can't really narrow it down to being, well, this is just merely the expression of one individual person and their legal consciousness. And how did they come to know this, and how did I find evidence of it? So actually some of the first documents I found of Black sailors, the very origins of this project many, many years ago, were of these legal petitions. And I found one from 1797, 4 enslaved sailors who called themselves Portuguese subjects and said they wanted a restoration of their natural liberty. And this idea that liberty was something that was innate. And the thing that sort of struck me about that first piece of evidence I found of what I would argue was Black mariners' sense of consciousness is that it was very assertive. And so, you know, I take that to mean that these people saw themselves as capable of manipulating their environment, of actually trying to transform the environment in which they lived and their place within it. And so a lot of times they weren't many lawsuits did not end in legal freedom, but at least it gives us a window into a sense that, you know, they were having these conversations. These conversations are very ephemeral. The legal suits are the only sort of remnants we have of these conversations, but that for those enslaved people who could achieve the status of Ladino, because they're highlighted as the individuals, the acculturated individuals are the ones who are most applying to use this law. If you could achieve that sort of fluidity in Portuguese legal knowledge and custom, you did have some confidence that you could apply it successfully to change your own situation. So I don't know if that totally gets at your question, because partially I think we don't quite know how they developed this legal consciousness, but I would say that it's collective, and it's also something that seems to travel particularly by ships. Right, particularly people who are wedded to this maritime life, who are, you know, talking to a huge range of people in the course of their travels, and through this they are able to come to a different kind of understanding of the geographic space of the Atlantic and what they can accomplish within that geographic space.
Yeah, I loved also reading about how they, you know, you utilize these sort of tensions with the crown, you know, the crown, and like, you know, like the warring of like the British trying to then get sort of hegemony of the seas versus the Dutch and the Portuguese, and they sort of use those tensions to kind of to their advantage. But sort of going off of that, you know, in Salvador de Bahia, you know, there's this you talk about the transatlantic merchants of or merchandising of basically African material cultures. And that was something I just am incredibly interested in, because here's this way in which these mariners have what you call like a liberty chest, in which they were able to put in whatever goods they can get from Africa. And then it manifests its way in which you sort of talk about some of the origins of candomblé, like in which, you know, the material goods, you know, foster this kind of marketplace vibrancy, you know, in Bahia, in Salvador de Bahia. And it kind of makes it actually seem like, I'm trying to remember which chapter this is, like number 6 or 5. It makes it this African place. It sounds very African, as opposed to even strictly South Atlantic or Brazilian, you know. So how did, you know, was it just in painstakingly going over the manifest and the voyages in which you found the fabrics and the materials and all of that, or how did that come about in your research for you to find?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I first started going through the ship manifest, it didn't initially strike me that there were all these African goods aboard these ships. It was only something that once I had left Brazil, left the archives, and sort of 6 months later, I was like, oh, wait a minute. Is it normal to have all these African goods? I mean, we know there are imports of palm oil and panos de costa, which is a particular kind of cloth that's particularly fabricated in Yoruba-speaking West Africa at this point. But, you know, there's also shells, there's also mats, there's, you know, kola nuts. There are all these things that later become really integral to the material world of candomblé. And I think one of the interesting things about using that kind of documentation to explore the cultural and religious lives of the enslaved is that you have to kind of marry this really hard, dry economic data, which, if I were, into cliometrics, or if I were an economic historian, I would probably just look at aggregate statistics. Oh, well, enslaved mariners only owned a small portion of these ship cargoes, so therefore whatever they're doing is unimportant in the grand scheme of things. But if you put those sort of fragments, these really dry just lists of goods and values and owners that you find in ship manifests, in conversation with religious studies, or with anthropology, or with art history, you come to appreciate that the value of these goods isn't just sort of commercial value, right? It's not the commodity values, the market value. It's the value is being able to access a kind of good that can then, as I argue in the book, provide a material basis for the emergence of new Afro-Brazilian religious forms, right? So there is some evidence that some of the men who were on these ships, particularly as freed barbers, later become integral to the earliest candomblé terreiros, or sort of proto-terreiros, these cult worship spaces in which you would have at least an altar to an orisha or a deity, in which you would offer particular kinds of goods. We know, for instance, some of the goods in the liberty chests of the sailors would later become really important to divination practices within candomblé. So one of the things I try to explain in the chapter is that even though these investments might seem on the small end of the scale, at least in terms of the total value of the transatlantic slave trade, they become really important in terms of creating these new kinds of religious spaces, and also this practice of self-fashioning, right? How do people within this milieu of freed and enslaved West Africans in Brazil become seen as important and leading members of their community? Well, if you have the kind of spiritual power that is given to you by these, imparted by these very potent ritual goods, that's one way that you can do that. In addition to accruing some small sum of money from the trading of these goods that you can then use to free yourself, to free family members, to purchase property, which also become important parts of the way that they establish themselves as really patrons in the community at this time.
And it seems like it might be almost Q&A time, but I wanted to get if this is just, oh, there's a sound. If there's one, I guess later I'll let someone else maybe ask this, but I really wanted to get at some point about your sort of central thesis, that space and the way in which the mariners are able to use space, the being able to go from one space to the other, the sort of fluidity of that, not just being on the ocean, but on the shore, to kind of then challenge the very notion of what it means to be enslaved. Like, I know that you may answer that in the question at some point, but I just want to sort of put a pin in that for maybe the Q&A, and perhaps we should just open it up to the Q&A for right now. Any questions?
Thank you, Zizi.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. This is a fantastic book. I just was just riveted the whole time.
We all are, yes. Skip, Professor Gates, do you have some comments?
Oh, I have a question. I enjoyed this very much, Mary. I had to step away to order my lunch from Darwin's and get my credit card. This is like serious business. Some sailors can wait. What will we learn from your book about slavery, about identity formation in the 18th, 19th centuries, about the Pan-African world, about whatever? What do we learn after we've read your last word that we didn't know when we picked up your book and read your introduction?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. So I think there are many big themes, hopefully. And as to the key question, and this is echoing a little bit of what Zizi brought up earlier about the question of slavery and space, I think there's a really strong and really important literature, for instance, on the management of plantation space. about these issues of confinement, oftentimes gendered confinement, resistance, surveillance, alternative geographies that enslaved people create in rural plantation settings. And there's a slightly smaller literature on the port city as a unique kind of space of slavery, in which geographic mobility can be tied to social mobility in a really important way. And, you know, I think even if you aren't familiar with colonial Brazil, we see this resonating in autobiography of Frederick Douglass, right? They're just Equiano. There's just so many important figures within the Black Atlantic world that, you know, these kind of transformative maritime spaces change or facilitate the change in their social status, that I think that this is not just a Brazilian story. What do we learn about identity formation? I don't think the book is quite Afrocentrist, but I do think that we have to take seriously if we admit that people are traveling back and forth, that there's a constant replenishment of people, you know, because of the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade coming from West Africa, West Central Africa. We really have to take seriously the impact of West and West Central African cultural forms and ideas on New World cultures. And just understanding the depth of that influence, I think is really important. And also to understand that people had a very contextualized protean identities. You could at once claim to be a Portuguese subject and also worship in this very Afro-Brazilian space that's suffused with, you know, ritual forms and symbols from West Africa that are very alien to that Western Portuguese sense of, you know, freedom or community or selfhood. So I think we have to understand that people were very simultaneous, you know, about the kind of identities they had. They weren't either African or, you know, Portuguese subjects. They weren't only, you know, mariners or, you know, religious men. You know, they could be both of these things at once. And so I hope that is a huge contribution. And also to really understand that, you know, slavery was brutal in terms of the laboring requirements exacted from enslaved people, but the kinds of skills that enslaved people brought to bear on Atlantic environments were really transformative to those environments. So seafaring would not have looked the same if enslaved Africans were not an integral part of that space.
So the two words, I was thinking of the word liminality, meaning, you know, the space in between. And you used the word protean, which is, we know, is fundamental to the hero in the West from Odysseus, right? I mean, a person who could morph into different identities. So what do these two terms, liminality and the protean, what do they do to the binary opposition that we've created between slave and free, Black and white, African and European? You know, we're taught to think of these institutions as stark opposites with no gray area. I mean, gray areas slipped in. We all remember when Malcolm X was talking about house slaves and field slaves, you know, which people have been talking about since the slave narrative. So the first time I heard that, I went, oh, so there were two kinds of slaves, right? I didn't know that. I only thought that there was one. But it turns out there were a zillion kinds of slaves. There were mixed race, there were people selling their bodies, there were people betraying each other, there were people running away, there were people keeping other Black people running away. You know, there was a cast of characters like a Shakespeare play. So I'm just wondering what the implications are of your study for teaching us about, I started to say who's responsible for the slave trade. I don't mean that, but who, what actions fostered the existence of the slave trade from within the broader quasi-slave community in a very curious way. You know, if your freedom embraced through a protean identity, right? if you can embrace the protean identity and achieve a measure of individual freedom, that depends upon a whole bunch of other people not being able to do that, right? So, and I'm not trying to cast aspersion on anybody. I'm just sort of interested in how all these bubbles of identity keep bumping into each other, if you can speculate on that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that gets to the whole, again, the whole kind of point of the book, which is that, you know, I think the challenge is that we tend to want to understand how these kinds of brutal exploitative systems were undone. But the other thing we have to understand is what allowed them persist for so long. And I think, Professor Gates, your question gets to that exactly, which is that some small measure of kind of
What'd you call me?
in, right?
What'd you call me? What's my name?
Professor Gates?
My name is Skip. You're a fellow. What are you talking about?
Well, you know, for the extended audience, for Skip. No, but I mean, this is the core kind of power dynamic that I think we need to understand in order to really recognize, well, why did Atlantic slavery persist so long? What made it so durable? And the fact that you could have these kind of shifting loyalties, you could produce a sense of loyalty to the system of slavery, even from the formerly or currently enslaved. I mean, we know that in part this was achieved through terror. I mean, that tends to be, I think, the more comfortable story, but some level of small inducement. And in a way, there's kind of, it's almost totalizing, because it's very hard to wholesale reject the kind of ideological, political, economic structures created by transatlantic slavery, even if you're continually on the losing end. Because I wouldn't say that these people benefited. I mean, they benefited in some small measure from transatlantic slavery. So for instance, one of the more disturbing stories I discuss in the book is these shipboard barbers who would then take the ill enslaved people who couldn't be sold on the open market and try to heal them, treat them, and then sell them themselves. So, you know, you're by the time you're already being displaced by the transatlantic slave trade, your options are so limited, right? That kind of buying in, perpetuating in some extent, being complicit to some extent in transatlantic slavery is the one kind of opening that you tend to have. And in terms of criminality, oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying complexity. The thing is, it was far more complicated than our binary models allow for.
Yeah, and one of the things about reading the Salvador chapter, which is about those barbers, is it just the sort of like, you read the line about how them healing the captives on their ships, perpetuated the trade, because basically it fostered it and allowed for their longevity to be such that they live for longer, which of course is good for a free life, but then to perpetuate slavery itself is like sort of horrific to read about.
And also that they might not have identified with the people they were healing. Yes, they could have to some degree. And that's part of the reason why I think they were successful healers, is because they could make their treatments legible in a way to enslaved people held in cargoes. But they also had occupational identities. They identified with social networks that were already existing in Brazil, which would have made them separate from enslaved people who were just arriving in Brazil.
And then also the word Creole, which in your book you're talking about, in Portuguese, it specifically does, you couldn't be West African, you could be of West African heritage, but as long as you were born in the New World, then you're considered a Creole. So that different definition kind of seems to, go ahead.
This is very important. The word Creole, which we, think means mixed race, didn't mean that at all. It just meant a person from Africa or Europe born in the New World. It was a strictly descriptive term. And how it then morphed to mean someone genetically mixed is fascinating. And when that did is fascinating as well. Just footnote, right, Mary?
And it's a Portuguese term originally too, so.
We have a couple of questions from the audience. Would you entertain them, Mary? Entertain the questions?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, one is from Phyllis Chestang. I'm not sure if I pronounced the name correctly. Would you mind giving us your question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm finishing my PhD, and one of the stories I developed had to do with the I call it the Sheba Ghost ship, telling stories of the 3 million ships, sunken ships, and the maritime trade. So I believe my question was, have you looked at the pursuit of a religious vocation, either the ministry or for Catholics, the priesthood, as a way of achieving freedom or a certain amount of freedom in your studies? And again, I thank you so much for your work. There have been so many gaps, and you're helping to fill the gaps in my work. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Catholic religiosity does play a large role in the book, mostly in terms of the kind of social networks that it fosters. So I don't look at clergy specifically, even though there are, African and Afro-Brazilian members of the clergy, but I look specifically at the kind of religious brotherhoods that particularly free Africans create, and how that enables. So firstly, it's an autonomous social space, but it's also a space of mutual aid and a space to liberate individual enslaved people through either legal strategy or through the accumulation of enough funds to free that person through purchase manumission. And so that's the what I focus on in the book. And there's starting to be really interesting work in the period before I study and then after I study, which looks at these spaces as abolitionist spaces in the South Atlantic. And that's one way in which it's different than the North Atlantic. And so in the period before I detail, some Catholic brotherhoods in Lisbon they articulate what we might call proto-abolitionist sentiment, which is far earlier than is occurring in the Anglo-Atlantic world. So that's one interesting thing. We usually think of the South Atlantic as, quote unquote, backwards. Hopefully no academic writer would call it that anymore, but we tend to think of it as sort of behind in terms of the modern transformations of the Atlantic world. But in this instance, it appears that they are earlier in terms of fomenting, at least in these small spaces, a kind of abolitionist sentiment.
Thank you, Mary.
Mary, I'm sorry, I have to bail for a 2:00 another Zoom thing, but you guys stay on. Fascinating, wonderful to see you again. Glad you're making such progress and you're doing such brilliant work. ZD, great job of introducing and hosting. Krishna, I'll see everybody soon. See you next Wednesday. Okay, have a good weekend.
Thank you. Ben Wendorf.
Hi, Mary. Congratulations on your book. Awesome. I mean, a culmination of so much incredible work. I just had a question. Could you speak to the relationship between the Quilombos and the Black Mariners, sort of reaching into the interior a bit further?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually had that before, is how is the form of marinage that I talk about in the book, which is seaborne marinage, running to particular legal authorities distinct from what's going on in the Quilombos. And as far as I can tell, there is very little connection, even though in the early 19th century, there starts to be this kind of paranoia among the Bahian elite that there are all these outside seditious forces infiltrating these porous port spaces. And so it's a little unclear whether or not they're sort of imagining this, because I mean, in my opinion, from reading many documents, elites just tend to be very paranoid in general, and sometimes make things up and fantasize about things that aren't happening. But it does appear that not necessarily the deep water sailors, but these kind of lighter men and men who are canoemen and who are navigating these small rafts called jangadas are seen by authorities as a kind of link between a potentially subversive, what they see as French or Jacobin outside influence, anti-slavery influence, and rural populations. They never go as far as to say, you know, sailors are going into the interior and inspiring these people to join quilombos, but they are very afraid that they could incite, you know, basically anti-slavery violence or anti-slavery sedition in the countryside. And so later in the century, after, you know, my book ends, there are these efforts to sort of whiten the maritime labor force, in part as a result of the the Malay revolt, because there's this idea that subversive ideas could potentially be transmitted through these really mobile Afro-Brazilian laborers. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I haven't found a direct link between the two, but it was a constant fear.
Thank you, Mary. Current fellow Kate DeLuna has a question. Kate,
Hi, yes, I'm here. Sorry I don't have my video on. Thank you, Mary, for this wonderful talk. I'm so excited to learn from you. And I want to admit first that I'm an Africanist. And so my question is going from that perspective. I was wondering if you could tell us more about how your thoughts about the legal culture connect to African legal cultures that you studied on the continent.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I know there's been, it's in the Lusophone literature, in the Lusophone African world in this time, there's actually been some pretty good studies, Joaquinaldo Ferreira, Mariana Candido, discussing the ways in which, at least in places like Luanda and Benguela, there's this interplay between African conceptions of the law and Portuguese conceptions of the law. And one of the interesting things I think about the legal history chapter for me is that, based on at least what Mariana Candido has argued, there is this idea that if you were enslaved and you went through the transatlantic slave trade, you were not a vassal according to kind of legal custom that's evolving in Benguela at this time. So the fact that these mariners and people associated with them are claiming vassalage, not every legal case claims this, but some do claim vassalage, is in a way in a contradiction to that West Central African, at least in the sort of nucleus of Portuguese colonialism there, is in contradiction to that, what had been worked out with Sobas, between Sobas and Portuguese colonial authorities, that, you know, vassals couldn't be enslaved. So I don't know if I have any very, you know, sort of clear-cut examples of, let's say, an African sense of justice or legal principle being translated into these free soil suits. But it does appear that they're at least a little bit in contradiction, as far as I understand it, from Candido's work, in contradiction to what Portuguese subjects, African Portuguese subjects, are arguing in Benguela.
Thank you. One last question from Professor Ma Seyahu. Is he still here?
Yes, I'm still here. I'm sorry, I'm in transition to a meeting. Glad I could get on quickly. Dr. Hicks, excellent work. Glad to see you. I had two brief questions. One, in your research, did you ever come across the term Moro in reference to any of those who were of African heritage with reference to their origin? Number two, more thoughtful question is, what are the implications today for the intersection of racial caste and occupation that could help in a K-12 space for students who don't have this niche knowledge to understand how occupation and job choice actually can lead to increased information, knowledge, and even the possibility of freedom.
So I thank you for the question. I don't think I've come across that term specifically. Yeah, I would actually have to go back through, like I'd have to do a keyword search, but I don't recall ever coming through across that term. And in terms of occupation, so I think it can tell us many things. One is that there is this very long history of Europeans associating Africans with as being predisposed to particular types of labor, right? And I think we're probably more familiar with the idea that Africans are predisposed to hard agricultural labor, right? That's really a cornerstone ideological principle of mature Atlantic slavery. But even very early on, as they're exploring the West African coast, they say, oh, Africans are such great swimmers. They have so much navigational knowledge. They understand the currents. So they're almost always imagined to have this kind of preternatural disposition to watery environments. And of course, then you can say, oh, of course, then they're predisposed to be enslaved and then, serve us, labor for us. So that's the kind of dark side of it. The other thing I guess I would say in the sort of more positive note is that I do think that this is a very dark portrait of labor in the early modern world, but it's also on the flip side, and this gets back to Zizi's first question about creativity. Self-actualization through labor is also part of the story too. And of course, we need to understand that these mariners are operating in relation to very degraded forms of labor. And so therefore, comparatively, they have it, they have a lot of freedom, they have a lot of autonomy, even though they have many, many hardships. But they constantly evoke, when they're describing themselves, this identity of mariner. And when they escape, they want to become mariners, or maintain this occupation of mariner. So I think what that does tell us is, even though early modern slavery, the labor regimes of it are highly degrading and dehumanizing, on the flip side, people do find some kind of meaning, identity, empowerment through labor and the kind of social associations they gain through that labor.
And in particular, the word that you use, I think, which I go back to all the time, is cosmopolitan. I mean, this idea that basically, here they are, the merchants of these vessels are basically using their knowledge and their ingenuity and their reaping the intellectual rewards for these mariners actually just coming up with different things on their own, navigationally, moving through all these different spaces, like them actually being able to be to not just transliterate, but translate various from one language to the other, and not just translate language, but then also culture to be these go-betweens. And so they really were these sort of cosmopolitan forces, and you can sort of see that in every chapter, which I applaud your scholarship. It was so amazing to be taken on this journey, and to be able to see, certain shorelines, vistas, certain cities, towns, these flying fish of in the various places in the marketplace, and the Pinos de, I'm getting it wrong, the Pinos de Cota. Yeah, the Pinos de Cota. All of those things it was just a wholly original book. Thank you so much, Mary. Just a triumph.
Thank you. And I'll also thank you, Krishna, really quickly. Thank you to you and to Skip, not Professor Gates, for creating such a wonderful generative environment. I've learned a lot from Zizi in my time at the center, and continue to learn from her. So I feel like without that space, this book would not have been possible.
Well, thank you for sharing such an extraordinary work with us. And it's protean in itself, and the way it brings together archival sources and multiple areas of study. And to echo Skip's words, it is really brilliant, and I can't wait. We all can't wait to see it on the bookshelves.
Hey, Mary, quickly, we have a question about when and where is your book available?
Oh gosh. Oh, well, it it's not yet completed. So, but hopefully it will be out at the end of next year, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you, Zizi. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Krishna. Thank you, Professor Gates. And thank you, Professor Hicks.
Thank you so much.
See you soon.